We've been dealing with different interpretations of Genesis 1. And we looked at the literal interpretation, we looked at gap interpretations, at day-age interpretations. And today we come to number 5, the so-called Revelation Day interpretation. The Revelation Day interpretation holds that the 7 days spoken of in Genesis 1 are not days of creation, but days of revelation. That is to say, these are 7 consecutive days on which God revealed to Moses, or whoever the author of Genesis was, what God did in creating the world. So each day is a literal consecutive day, but they're not days of creation. These are days of revelation of God's creative activity rather than a description of the 7 days of creation themselves. So Revelation Day interpretation substitutes 7 consecutive days of revelation for 7 consecutive days of creation. What might we say by way of assessment of this theory? Well, I have to say that this view strikes me as rather implausible. There's nothing, again, in the text itself to suggest that we're dealing here with revelatory days, 7 consecutive days of revelation. There's no such phrase as, then the word of the Lord came to me again, saying, etc., or then the Lord spoke to me, saying such and such. There's simply nothing in the text that suggests that we're dealing here with 7 consecutive days of revelations to the author. On the contrary, the days are described as what God does on each successive days, the things that he creates on those successive days. And then at the end of each period of creation, he pronounces it good. And then comes the evening and the morning. And so there's no suggestion here, I think, that what we're dealing with are days of revelation rather than days of God's creatorial activity. So I find this view to be one that is pretty implausible. Any comments or discussion about this view? No, you're just shaking your head. No. Yeah. Anybody else? All right, well, let's go on then to a more interesting view. Number 6, the literary framework interpretation. The literary framework interpretation has been ably defended by the French New Testament scholar Henri Blocher. Though I confess to having heard on the lips of my American colleagues the view attributed to Henry Blocker. Henri Blocher wrote a book called In the Beginning, in which he defends the literary framework view. Now, according to this view, the author of Genesis 1 is not interested in chronology. He is not attempting to relate one view after another in chronological fashion. Rather, the days serve as a sort of literary framework on which he can hang his account of creation. He wants to describe how God is the source of all life. God is the creator of all the world. And he uses the framework of 6 days as a literary structure on which to hang his account. But he doesn't intend for this literary structure or framework to be interpreted in a chronological way. Now, ever since the Middle Ages, biblical commentators have noticed that there seems to be a sort of parallelism between the first 3 days and the second 3 days in Genesis chapter 1. Corresponding to the first day is day 4, corresponding to the second day is day 5, and corresponding to the third day is day 6. And Blocher also sees this structure as significant. He says that on the first 3 days, God creates the domain or the space for a certain life form or entity. And then on the correlated second 3 days, he creates the occupants of the space or the domain. So, to give an example, on day 2, the text says that God separates the waters which are above the heavens from the waters which are below the heavens. And then on the 5th day, he creates the sea creatures and the birds to inhabit the waters and to fly through the heavens where the water has been cleared away. Similarly, on day 3, God is said to create the dry land and the vegetation and the fruit trees. And then on day 6, he creates the land animals and man to occupy the dry land. And notice also that on the 3rd and the 6th day, there is a double work of creation on both of those days. On day 3, there's the dry land and the vegetation, 2 acts of creation. And then on day 6, there are 2 acts of creation, the land animals and then human beings. So the idea is that on the first 3 days, God creates the habitats or the domains, and then on the second day, he creates the inhabitants or the denizens of the domain. So the creation account is not intended to be chronological. Rather, the creation week is a sort of thematic or literary framework on which to hang a non-chronological account. Now, is there any comprehension type question about the literary framework view before I say something by way of assessment? Not a critical question, but do you understand the view that Blocher is laying out? Okay, good. Then that is clear. Now, I think that this is an extremely interesting view, which is ably defended by Blocher, and so it deserves serious consideration. I do have to confess, however, being somewhat skeptical about the alleged parallelism between the first 3 days and the second 3 days, days 1 to 3 and 4 to 6. A closer reading of the text shows that these days are not really parallel in an exact way. For example, on day 4, God creates the lights in the sky, the great light, the sun, the lesser light, the moon, and the stars. So he creates the heavenly luminaries on day 4. Now, what corresponds to God's creating the lights in the firmament on day 4? Well, clearly, it's God's creation of the firmament on day 2. On day 2, he creates the firmament, and then on day 4, he places the lights in the firmament. Now, the separation of darkness and light on day 1 that takes place isn't really the creation of a place for the sun and the moon and the stars. That comes on day 2 when God creates the firmament. That is the place or the domain in which then on day 4 God places the sun and the moon and the stars. Similarly, on day 5, God creates the sea creatures. Now, what corresponds to God's creating the sea creatures? Well, it's his creation of the seas on day 3. That's where the verbal linkage is. True, on day 2, he separated the waters above the heavens from the waters below the heavens. But it's not until day 3 that the waters below the heavens are gathered into seas and are given the name seas. And then on day 5, God creates the sea creatures to inhabit the domain of the sea. So again, it's not really parallel to day 2, where he simply separates the waters above the heavens from the waters below the heavens. Finally, on day 3, notice that you have not simply the creation of the dry land. It's not simply barren. You also have the creation of the vegetation and the fruit trees which inhabit the dry land, which grow on the dry land. So on day 3, God does not simply create a domain or a space. He also creates some of the inhabitants or some of the things that live in that domain. And I think it would be a real stretch of the imagination to think that the vegetation is meant to be a domain in which man and the animals are going to live, and they're created on day 6. So I have to say I'm not really persuaded that this parallelism is actually there in the text, as opposed to a sort of construction that the interpreter is imposing on the text or reading into the text. I don't think that this parallelism is really there in the way described. It seems to be a construction or manufacture of the interpreter, in this case, Blocher. Now, having said that, I don't think that the literary framework view is committed to saying that the framework should be understood in terms of domains and inhabitants of those domains. As we'll see when we get to the view of functional creation, which we'll talk about next time, there's a parallelism also seen between the days, but it's interpreted in a different way than domains and denizens of those domains. So I don't think the literary framework view stands or falls on this particular interpretation of the parallels, but nevertheless it does seem, I think, to call into question Blocher's view. Secondly, moreover, I'm not convinced yet that the chronology in the narrative is not to be taken seriously. On the literary framework view, the chronology is meaningless, but surely the idea of numbering the consecutive days, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, with these ordinal numbers as the author does, and the progression from desolation in the beginning, the primordial seas, nothing alive, to the appearance of the dry land, then the vegetation, then the animal life, and finally culminating in man. And then on the 7th day, God's resting, finally, from his work of creation. Surely that suggests that chronology is part of this narrative. And Blocher admits that this motif of creation in 6 plus 1 days is a common motif in ancient creation myths, such as Egyptian creation stories. And so that raises the question, well, if this is a common motif in the ancient world, why think that here in Genesis 1 that this isn't meant to be taken seriously? Why think this is just a literary device rather than genuine chronology? Notice that merely showing a parallelism doesn't show it to be non-chronological. You could still have parallelism between the days and have them chronologically ordered. So I have some skepticism about this view. Nevertheless, I think this is a very substantive and interesting view that deserves further exploration. All right, any discussion then about Blocher's literary framework view? Taewan.
Well, it's very interesting, and I believe in the chronology, but the context and the content, the first 3 days and the later 3 days, I think it's in place if you see it as the boundary. When
as a what?
Boundary.
A battery?
Boundary.
Oh, a boundary.
Yeah.
Okay, boundary.
When he created the light, and the boundary is set between light and darkness.
Yes.
And then the second day is heaven and earth.
Yes.
The third day is land and sea.
Uh-huh.
And then the content comes in that boundary. And then he rested. And the interesting thing is human beings are trying to remove all the boundaries. And so the judgment comes in Noah's day when he removed the boundary between land and sea.
Wow. Have you come up with this interpretation yourself?
Well, I am studying BSF right now,
I
and
see.
as I answer those questions, all these ideas comes in. So you are just talking about, and I just thought it's exciting for me to realize what.
Well, I must say I'm impressed. I mean, I do think that the idea of setting boundaries between darkness and light, waters above and waters below, dry lands and seas, is much more plausible than Blocher's view. So I'm impressed. Okay, so somebody else. Yes, Jim Hilton back here. Oh, yes, back here. Jim has got a
Bill, thanks. That is very interesting, and I'm going to have to go back and listen to. We've missed a few lessons, but this is very interesting. But my question is, how would that have been something his original audience, Moses, I guess, original audience, would have understood about the creation account? Would the Jews, would the Hebrews have understood it? And kind of how would that fit in with Moses' purpose in writing that story in the first place?
That's the key question, isn't it, Jim? And Blocher thinks that they would. He thinks that these original readers would have understood or wouldn't have at least been misled by a literary or thematic arrangement in which God is doing something like creating domains and then inhabitants or perhaps boundaries and then content. Although Blocher doesn't really come to grips much, as I say, with the fact that this is a motif that is found in other ancient creation stories. And I think he needs to look at that and show us that that's not chronological either. If he could show us that in these other creation myths, this is merely literary, that would provide a very powerful argument in favor of thinking that it's merely literary here. But if in these other myths it looks chronological, then that would weigh against his view. And I don't think, at least as I recall in reading his book, that he does much. He's aware of these things, but he doesn't discuss them a whole lot. We'll see when we get to functional creation and the Hebrew myth interpretation that these authors are much more in dialogue with the creation stories of Israel's neighbors and seeing what clues they might provide for how original readers would have interpreted these.
Building on what Taiwan was saying, the Hebrew word for firmament is actually hammered out sheet. It's the same word that's used for the covering in the temple, on covering the like the table and stuff like that. The sheets of gold, hammered out firmament, same word.
Yes, as we'll see when we get to the functional creation, this becomes a very important argument in the hands of John Walton for his view of interpreting Genesis 1 not in terms of what he calls material creation, but functional creation, because he says if you interpret this as literal material creation, then you're committed to what Steve said, namely that there's some sort of a solid dome up there in the sky, like a hammered out piece of metal. There's this solid dome up there in the sky that separates the waters above from the waters below, and occasionally it opens and the waters leak through and it rains. And of course, no one with a modern scientific knowledge thinks that there is such a thing as this solid dome in the sky. The question there, I think, will be, did these ancient Hebrews think so literally, or could they use metaphors as well? Walton thinks not. All right, Eric, let's take your comment.
Something I learned from Hugh Ross this weekend, actually, biblical Hebrew only has 3,000 words in it. It has a 3,000 word vocabulary, and that's it. I think that's something that has to be kept in mind when looking at the original words. They didn't have that much to choose from. So
that's a good point. So are you saying this with respect to the solidity of the firmament?
Exactly. They could only describe the firmament using so many words, and they, with only 3,000, you have to pick words that can have more than one meaning. It might not be quite as literal.
Yeah. Okay, let's not focus on that at this point, because I do want to make sure we understand the literary framework view and any critique or assessment I've offered of that. Any further discussion of the literary framework view as opposed to the firmament?
Do you believe that the ancient translations, such as the Targums or the Septuagint, will give any value to this discussion?
That's a good question, Drew. I have to confess that in the work that I've read, commentaries and so forth on Genesis 1, there doesn't seem to be much appeal to Targums in terms of understanding what they said. I'm not familiar with that, any literature of that nature. These were Jewish paraphrases or commentaries that could lend insight to how they understood various scriptures.
Yeah, one could, because it was so much before modern science, one could sort of see, is this like literal or is this more figurative? And also the ancient Greek of the Septuagint had an enormous vocabulary. It was based on the Greek of the ancient philosophers. So it might, maybe it would help, maybe it wouldn't, because they'd just be literal in translating it. So
or it could be something that's used metaphorically. You're using a dome as a metaphor, something for a boundary. But yes, the Septuagint, it would be interesting to see what Greek word they use for rendering firmament. I don't know. As I say, that's not really pertinent to the literary interpretation view. All right, well, we're out of time. So next time we'll come back and we're going to look at the functional creation interpretation next time. That is a different interpretation that is on your outline. So number 7 next week will be functional creation.